My presentation is on Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, and basically I'm going to go through a little bit of an introduction about who Ludwig Mies van der Rohe is, a little bit about his specific architectural philosophy, and then I'm going to explore some of his international works as some of his works in the U.S. and talk about specifically how he weaved into those works his specific modernist philosophy, and then from there talk a little bit about his legacy on the architectural community, and that will be the presentation. So let's start off with a little bit of an introduction. So Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, he's commonly called Mies, just Mies, and he was German-born in 1886. He started his architectural career with an apprenticeship under Peter Behrens, which was another architect at the time in Germany in the early 1900s. And he really began to rise to prominence after creating the German Pavilion, which we talked about in class for the International Exposition in Barcelona. And after he created the German Pavilion, he went on to direct the Bauhaus School of Design, which was a design school in Germany for architecture. However, he eventually had to leave there after a couple of years and emigrate to the U.S. Because he was facing some Nazi political pressure. And it was actually in the U.S. where he made some of his most famous work. Um, and what he's really famous for is his modernist architecture style that really shaped a lot of the modernist architecture of the 20th century. So let's talk about a little bit more how he developed this modernist style. So Ludwig Mies really described his architecture as skin and bones architecture in the sense that it was very minimalist in structure. He used pretty basic materials and he focused on, again, very rationalist and minimalist designs. So he really began to develop this style after being exposed to progressive German culture through his apprenticeship with Peter Behrens. That's where he really first learned it, and also in the wake of World War One. So in the wake of World War One was really viewed as like a kind of a failure of old Europe and how it was ran, and a lot of artists and architects at the time really wanted to, toss the baby out with the bathwater in the sense that they thought that old Europe had really failed in terms of how it was running, so they wanted to kind of throw out those old designs as well of old Europe and focus on a more modern approach. Um, so that's like the time that Mies was living in that really allowed him to get these influences. And in the early 1920s, really the type of architecture that he was doing was called the International style, which is really just a subset of this modernist architecture. And as we kind of touched on before, and we'll touch on later as well, his big break really came in 1929 with the German Pavilion, and it really represented a culmination of these modernist ideals that he began to develop. And Walter Gropius, who was another modernist architecture at the time, was really impressed with Mies, and he offered him a position as the director at Bauhaus, as we talked about before, and it was really at Bauhaus that he continued to develop this style. He was surrounded by other modernist architects like Gropius at the time as well. And really the main tenets of his philosophy were rationalism and minimalist. And he had a really famous saying in architecture, and he said, less is more. And he meant that buildings that don't really have, aren't super ornate or something like that can still be very beautiful in terms of their structure and the materials that are used and that type of stuff. So now let's examine, now that we've kind of talked about this a little bit, let's examine his international works. We're going to examine his international works and really analyze these buildings and see his architectural style in action. So the first work that I want to analyze is the Wiesenhof estate. So the Wiesenhof estate was designed by Mies in 1927 in Stuttgart, Germany, and it was really designed for the modern city dweller, like blue-collar workers and the middle class. So here it's really interesting because we can see how Mies's progressive tendencies were kind of expressed in his work in the sense that he wanted to build it for these type of people. And the Wiesenhof estate really contained light, very bright spaces, as well as lots of green space to kind of integrate nature into the design a little bit more. And again, as we can see in these pictures here, the housing designs were very simplistic, and that kind of ties in to exactly what Mies was always going after with his simplistic, minimalistic designs with materials like glass and steel and things like that. And these buildings would really go on to influence generations of other modernists. So now looking at the German Pavilion, we've touched on this a little bit, but again, uh, Mies built this for the 1929 International Exposition, and it was originally intended to host the King of Spain and German authorities. And it's made of steel, glass, and marble, which is common materials that he used because they were very simple. But he also had some interesting materials like red oinks and travertine. So he used lots of different materials for the German Pavilion, but the German Pavilion was really in line with Mies's ideals of simplicity, given the fact that the pavilion lacked a real exhibition space. Because, as Mies kind of said, it was supposed to be the exhibition itself. It was supposed to be its own work of art, not necessarily a place to host other works of art. So here we can see how this is in line with Mies's idea of skin and bones architecture. As you can see in the structure, there's a couple of steel beams holding everything up, and there's just very rigid geometric designs, and that's really what he meant when he said minimalist. Also, an interesting thing about the German Pavilion is this is also where Mies debuted the Barcelona chair, which was a minimalist chair design that still kind of exists today. And overall, this was an absolutely iconic building where you can really see Mies's less is more philosophy, and it's forever remained really prominent in the minds of modernist architects. So now going to look at some of Mies's domestic works, and after he came to the U.S., how he really brought his distinct style to the U.S., and he ultimately went on to craft some of his most influential works here. So through analyzing a couple of his U.S. works, we can see how he really shaped the foundations of 20th century modernist American architecture through his own style. So first we're going to start at the Farnsworth House. And the Farnsworth House was built between 1946 and 1951, and as you can see, it's one of the most minimalist houses ever designed, and it's really the epitome of Mies's less is more philosophy. It's a single-story house, and it contained 8 steel beams that held up the entire structure. It also had floor-to-ceiling glass windows, as you can see right here, which really beautifully integrates the house into the nature around it. And this is all about striving to achieve Mies's concept of a strong relationship between architectural works and their natural surroundings. So ultimately, Mies believed that by introducing nature into the residence, he could create a level of tranquility throughout the house that would not be realized in the absence of these natural settings. So as you can see, this is an incredibly simple design, basic design, but falls right in line with Mies's ideas of minimalism, rationalism, and things like that. And through the utter simplicity of this design, as well as the precision, as you can see, of the execution of Mies's ideals, the Farnsworth House continues to stand as a really foundational piece of mid-century modernism. Next, we're going to look at the Seagram building. It was completed in 1958. It's in New York City. And the Seagram building was Mies's first attempt at designing a tall office building through his minimalist style. So it stands at 38 stories and 515 feet, and the Seagram building was ultimately one of Mies's tallest works. So as you can see here, Mies really added a level of character to the building through his material selection, which included tinted glass and bronze I-beams. So through this selection, he was able to give the building a level of color, as you can see here on the right, and shine that really contrasted many of the strictly gray buildings at the time. Also, conforming to his previous ideals of incorporating nature into the surroundings of works, Mies actually included a large open plaza at the base of the Seagram building, setting it a little bit back from the street in order to maintain a little bit more of a natural feel. So ultimately, Mies's Seagram building really set the standard for the modernist skyscraper throughout the 20th century, setting the tone for the style of really corporate America at the time. Okay, so next, we're going to look at the last work that we're going to be looking at, which is his Lakeshore Drive Chicago apartments. So this is one of Mies's most famous commercial designs, and it really came to define high-rise living in Chicago for much of the 20th century. It was finished in 1951, and the 26-story towers, as you can see right here at the left, are actually designed to be set at right angles, which allows for really pristine views of Lake Michigan. So again, you can see Mies peppering in his own style here because these waterfront views, coupled with the views of the Chicago streets on the opposite side, further represented Mies's ideals of crafting works that would allow nature and surroundings to really be prominent features in the buildings. Again, the types of materials he used, you can really see the steel and the glass, again, being forefront in terms of his material selection. Again, conveying a pretty austere structure with fairly significant volume. So overall, these apartments still stand today, and again, another iconic building from Mies. So looking a little bit at Mies's legacy and just kind of to conclude the presentation. So throughout his career spanning nearly 6 decades, Mies really developed a very specific modernist style that would propel him to incredible success and recognition as one of the most famous architects to ever live. And really through his emphasis of things like open space and simplistic materials and minimalism and intertwining the nature into the surrounding works, Mies's works really went on to influence decades of architects. So that's my presentation on Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, his philosophy, how he developed it, and how his philosophy was present in his international works as well as his domestic works, and also touching on the legacy that he's had going forward. Thank you very much.